mRNA aerosols, stealth bioweapons that you breathe. Now, whatever your opinion of mRNA technology, at present you must receive a jab in order to be exposed to it. However, in the very near future, that will not be necessary. At that time, all you will need to do to be exposed is to breathe. Just breathe it in, because mRNA aerosols can now be made and invisibly you can be exposed. How does that make you feel? Today we're talking about that and the end time implications, and we're starting right now. In our opinion, scientists may have created the most fearsome weapon ever envisioned by man. Scarier than atomic weapons in some ways, and we haven't even begun to realize it yet. I bet this may be the first you're hearing about this technology. Now that genetic material can be aerosoled, there will never be a place you will be 100% safe again. It's colorless, odorless, invisible, and can be released into the atmosphere or any air conditioning or heating system, and no one will ever know that they've been exposed. That is, until you start getting sick, and some of the sicknesses may even take a long time before you notice. And for the information and even some of the text of this video, we need to give a shout out to Rick Knight, a longtime member of our community, my friend and warrior for Jesus Christ. Because it is now in the news every day, most people are becoming familiar with how mRNA works. Outside of the nucleus are cellular components inherited from your mother's side that do the manufacturing of proteins. These components are called ribosomes. mRNA enters the ribosome, and there it synthesizes the proteins by acting like a code or a design template for the proteins. This is the way it works in the jabs that are now in the news today and in the aerosols that are coming. Now, that particular mRNA in the jab creates the spike protein that produces both the immunity and the side effects that are so hotly debated. Now, you are probably wondering how mRNA can be used as a weapon. And in order to begin to talk about this, we need to understand how it is related to viruses. Viruses are incredibly simple things. Viruses are made of a single protected mRNA or DNA strand surrounded by a shell that is covered by proteins. For instance, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 is made up of 28 proteins and a single RNA strand. That's it, just 28 proteins, in contrast to the human body, which may contain up to 400,000 different proteins. Now, these proteins in a virus allow it to attach to a cell wall and open it up, allowing the virus to send its mRNA or DNA instructions into the cell. Once in there, the virus reprograms that cell to make copies of itself. These proteins that attach to the cell membrane or wall have to be an exact match to the point in the cell where they attach, or they'll just drift around the body until the immune system destroys them. This location on the cell membrane is the infamous binding site. But before RNA or DNA enters the cell, it has to be protected because it will be destroyed outside of the cell without protection. In the last few years, scientists have discovered ways to modify existing viruses to manufacture specific proteins, using the virus as the protective shell and the means to enter the cell. An example is a protein that breaks up the surface tension of the fluid in the lungs of cystic fibrosis patients so that it doesn't coat the lungs and cut off oxygen exchange. That's a good usage. Scientists call this process gene therapy. It has traditionally required using a full virus because the shell protects the RNA or DNA before it enters the cell, and the proteins allow it to attach to the cell to inject the instructions. This is similar to the J&J vaccine, which uses an adenovirus. It needed the adenovirus to carry and insert the instructions. But as you probably know, scientists have now figured out how to use mRNA instructions without the use of a full virus. The mRNA instructions can be injected straight into a body and travel to the cell unstopped because of using this process. It doesn't get destroyed outside of a cell, and it doesn't need the viral protein to let it in. Most of you are familiar with this because this methodology is used in several of the COVID-19 vaccines. The current mRNA tech uses a lipid nanoparticle to stabilize the RNA outside of the cell. But in order to utilize this technology, it still requires extreme cold storage, I'm sure you've heard of that, and a direct injection into the body, a jab. Both requirements, are a disadvantage. However, those requirements have already been overcome, and this is where the frightening idea of weaponizing mRNA comes into play. MIT has discovered a method to turn RNA into an aerosol so that it can be suspended in the air and you can just breathe it in, or it can be absorbed through your skin. You don't have to get a jab. You just walk into an area where it's floating in the air and it will begin to affect your cells. Think about that for a minute. Think about the potential uses and misuses of that technology. Of course, scientists focus on the positive uses of technology like this. It can make therapeutic proteins that treat diseases like cystic fibrosis, as we just mentioned, or it can make the spike proteins that encourage antibody development as a prophylactic against other viruses, such as COVID. It potentially can cure some types of cancer. Those are the positive humanitarian uses. Negative uses are also possible, of course. It can be used to build harmful viruses or allergenic proteins that could cause anaphylactic shock, autoimmune diseases. It can create proteins that cause cancer and even new cells that do not contain your DNA or even human DNA. Every person on Earth needs to understand these last points, that this aerosol tech has the power to hijack your cells and force them to make any type of protein the mRNA is programmed to make. Your DNA is no longer in charge. If you're exposed to this weapon, your body is no longer yours to control. And because there are a lot of bad actors out there, criminals, terrorists, and even politicians and governments, now that genetic material can be aerosoled, there will never be a place where you or I will be 100% safe again. As we said, it's colorless, it's odorless, and it's invisible. If you thought you could avoid mRNA by simply avoiding the jab, well, think again. Now that this tech has been unleashed, there will be no stopping the horror that can be done with this weapon. Every disease known to man can be generated. Even new diseases can be created. It is a weapon so obscene that we will long for the days of the atomic age. And this tech isn't expensive or even complicated to make. So I bet you're already thinking about some end-time implications. But what are others? What are the ones this channel is thinking about? The first is in regard to this technology being used by the Antichrist and or Mystery Babylon as a weapon. The fourth seal of Revelation contains a very strange passage that we have looked at before, but whose meaning is becoming more clear on a weekly basis. I looked, and there before me was a pale, and perhaps that's better read green, because the Greek word is chloros, horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by, and the better word here is under, the wild beasts of the earth. Green is the color of plague in the Bible, Leviticus 13:49 and many other passages. So, relating this seal to pestilence is acceptable. Green can also be considered Muhammad's color, but let's stick to the pestilence idea here in this video. So the rider of this horse is Death, And he kills by three methods: sword, famine, and pestilence. And he does this under the authority of the beasts. The Greek preposition preceding the word beasts, as we said before, is under, hypo in the Greek, not by, as translated in the ESV. So the beasts, the Antichrist, the false prophet, and possibly the other beasts of Daniel 7, are given this authority by death to kill by these three means of sword, famine, and plague. Now, famine and plague are not normal means of execution or killing. This seal's text tells us these things aren't the natural consequences of events like war or earthquakes, as commonly taught, but are weapons used by the beast. That means the beasts will use bioweapons. And this mRNA aerosol is a likely means that the beasts may use against their enemies, and even against their own people. In the recent pandemic, astute Christians have seen how the masses can be motivated to take a jab to protect their physical lives. It is highly conceivable, then, that the Antichrist would spread a disease using mRNA aerosol technology and have a vaccine waiting in the wings as a miracle cure. Of course, the only way to get the cure might be to worship the beast. It is a highly conceivable idea that everyone should have in the back of their minds. This brings us, of course, to our current situation in 2021. I'm sure a lot of people are seeing some similarities. In regard to those fearing and avoiding the current jabs, as we said earlier, if you thought you could avoid this technology by avoiding a jab, well, that will soon no longer be the case. Governments, in a frantic effort to provide what they think is protection, could release mRNA in stealth mode without you knowing. This is something to consider. I do not put it past our current governments. And of course, this brings up the mark of the beast. There are many who think the current jab is that mark. But can the mark be given without your consent? Can you be fooled into taking the mark of the beast? Click right here to keep watching for this most important aspect of the mark. Can you take it and not know it? Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.